find them. So it is 12:02 according to my clock, 12:03. So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. Learn more about Metro Nashville Public Schools and their plan for children returning to school. This should be very, very interesting. I know that Joyce McDaniel told me there's a lot of people who are paying attention to this. So we're expecting a lot of inside information, Frida and Christian, even though we may not get it. But I'm the Vice Mayor, Jim Schulman. I also serve as treasurer for the Women's Political Collaborative of Tennessee. I hear children running around in the background, so I was supposed to remind everybody to mute their mics and turn off their videos.
Can I interrupt you for just a moment, Vice Mayor Schulman?
Sure.
I'm sorry. So that's my little one running around in the background. Oh. I will admit though, one thing that I've loved about our time kind of shut down is that we're normalizing parenting. We're normalizing young people, hearing them in the background, even though it's sometimes a distraction. I appreciate that in the different spaces I've been in, people are accepting of that, but it's not nap time, so we'll have him pipe down. I will say the last time I was in the council chambers, I had my 2-year-old with me, and he was actually taking Vice Mayor Schulman's wallet and throwing all the credit cards out. So great memory for us. Great first time for him in the chamber.
It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for being gracious.
And I remember about a month later, there were a lot of purchases on my credit card bill. It was amazing all the things that he bought. It was a lot of purchases from Sesame Street, Elmo, all those different things. So anyway, all right. Before I introduce our moderator, I'm supposed to encourage you to consider joining WPCTN. If you're not already a member, easy to do. Go visit the website at WPCTN.com. Membership is $75 per year and helps everybody do these types of programs. And I know that there's a lot of people obviously interested in this program today. There's over 100 people that registered. Next program, Friday, July 17th. Congressman Jim Cooper, State Representative Bob Freeman, and our own council member Sandra Sepulveda discussing the state of Congress, state of Tennessee, and Metro Nashville. So watch the website for details on registering. Also, I think you can look in the chat box for links about how to join both WPCTN and how to register for the next programs coming up. All right, so it's my great honor to introduce your moderator. Ursha Syed is a graduate of Center College and the University of Kentucky College of Law. She's a Wildcat. She serves as the parliamentarian of the Women's Political Collaborative. Ursha started her career at Metro Nashville Public Schools over 10 years ago as an English teacher at Whites Creek High School. We didn't know that, so that's very, very good. She's currently an administrator at Nashville Classical. So she is an avid runner, loves to cook, and her birthday, which she told me about 25 times, is coming up. It's in August the 14th. She expects everyone to give her a present. August the 14th, I forget what day of the week that is, but I'm sure she probably knows. Ursha, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Vice Mayor. I appreciate that kind and detailed introduction. So I'm so happy to moderate the discussion today on Metro Nashville Public Schools opening plan this fall. So our panelists today have an enormous responsibility, and that's during a typical school year. So MNPS is our nation's 42nd largest school system, and it educates over 85,000 children and employs 10,000 adults. Additionally, students in our school system come from 120 different countries and all walks of life. There are over 150 schools, and those include academic magnets, alternative schools, charter schools, and some of our beloved neighborhood schools as well. This past spring, MNPS opened a very different type of school, and that was our pandemic school. And so today we have the pleasure of being joined by Frida Player-Peters and Christian Buggs, who are going to tell us about how our district plans on reopening and meeting the needs of all of those schools and families. So Christian and Frida, thank you so much for joining us. Please take a moment to introduce yourselves to our audience, and then we will jump into questions.
My name is Frida Player-Peters. I am District 7 representative. I was appointed by the council in November to fill the vacancy left by Will Pinkston when he resigned. I'm currently on the ballot in August for a full 4-year term. The term expires this August. My daytime, I'm executive director of Emerge Tennessee. We elect Democratic women to office. I've been around the public MNPS system. I was the political director of SEIU Local 205. They represent the support staff at Metro School. So anybody who wasn't a teacher or a bus driver or a principal is who we represented. And then I worked at the Democratic Party for several years. So yeah, I've been around MNPS since 2010. I work with SEIU through several administrations and several boards. So thank you.
And my name is Christian Buggs. I'm actually a Nashville native, and my birthday is August 15th. I will be, well, I'm a lady, so I'm not gonna say how old I would be, but it was gonna be one of those milestone years, and I was gonna have a lot of fun, but that's neither here nor there. So I grew up in Nashville, and actually grew up in the Whites Creek area, the Bordeaux area, would have been zoned for Whites Creek, but graduated from one of our magnet schools, MLK, went on to Tennessee State, earned a physics degree, worked for NASA, and didn't see a lot of people that looked like me. That's the best way I can describe it. So decided that I would teach, came back, taught at Smithson Craighead, our very first charter school in the city, then transitioned over to Neely's Bend, which was eventually taken over by the state. And not knowing what that meant is what threw me into politics. It's what threw me into the school board. I have an uncle who's a state legislator, and he was actually sitting on the education subcommittee, and he invited me to just start hanging out at the Capitol, So I talked to my principal, and I threatened to quit. Like, look, I just need to understand what's happening with our city, with our state around education. So I think I'm just going to quit and, learn as much as I can. And she was a phenomenal administrator because she helped me think through what that would look like and how I could use that time to be a teacher leader. So she allowed me to take half days on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, which at the time were when the education subcommittees met for the House and the state. So I spent that semester just learning a lot between January and maybe mid-March, because, we had to prepare, pretend ready, because, assessments are a thing in MNPS. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But I spent time kind of learning, and to be frank, saw what I felt was a lot of incompetence up at the state board, at the state level, when it came to education, public education. So tried to insert my teacher voice, ran for school board, and here I am. Now, I had once planned on just being a one-term school board member because I wanted to inspire community members to be their authentic selves and to understand that anyone can do it, which is why I try to be as authentic as I can be. I try to make sure people see me in my truest element, because I want us to get away from the idea that politicians look a certain way, dress a certain way, talk a certain way. But I will admit, midway through my tenure, when we tried to, inject kind of some equity measures, and I saw the response from the community, I realized that there was a lot more work to do. And then I realized that my commitment to send my own toddler to his neighborhood school would mean that I needed to be ready to fight for resources. I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of this later, but I just want to make known to the community that schools aren't just good because there are good teachers there or because there are smart kids there. Teachers are grown, and students are developed by having community and parent support. But that's another rabbit hole for another day. So, ta-da, I am Christian Buggs. Thank you for having me so much.
Great. Thank you so much both for being here. For our audience, several of you submitted questions in advance, and so we are going to jump into those. If you don't hear an answer to a question that you would like answered, feel free to enter it into the chat. We're going to start with questions that specifically have to do with reopening in the middle of the COVID pandemic. However, if we have time, we'd love to ask our panelists questions about the school board in general. So feel free to submit both of those. So Frida and Christian, our first question is, what factors is MNPS considering when weighing the different options of opening in person versus virtually?
I think you look at the national plan. First depends what phase we are as a city, determined by Mayor Cooper. And I didn't say this in my intro, but I worked in the mayor's office under the Briley administration. So part of it is the main kind of framework is where we are as a city. What phase are we in? How long are we going to be in that phase? And what does it look like to that? I think that's the first primary part, determines whether we can gather in persons by what's set by the health department and by the mayor's office, and of course by the state. So that's the first and primary part to look at, where we are, what current phase, and kind of the spread rate. And then also what can we do to make sure that we can, create kind of a safe environment, that we don't, you know, multiply or be vectors in the spread of COVID. And so those are the main things that we look at: where we are, what phase are we in, and what's the likelihood of how long we'll be in that phase.
And I want to take this time to make sure community members understand that we see you and we hear you. We understand that there are so many different moving parts. We are not making decisions around the start of school, or even what our school year will look like in in silos, or in a vacuum. I myself know that even though I'm working, and it is sometimes hard to hear my son in the background, that I am very privileged in that I have a great support system around, that my full-time job, I work at United Way. I'm a manager of partnerships, so I bring the community to the table, that they have been very, very open and loving, toward me having my son, right? But again, I'm privileged in that way. If I, based on the different health determinants and the guidelines that the health department puts out, I don't feel comfortable sending my son a lot of different places, right? So I can keep him at home. But there are parents who don't have that luxury. We still have to always be mindful of maintaining health and safety of our staff and students. And we also have to be aware that there are going to be outside factors that we can try to wrap our arms around, like feeding students, feeding children. I mean, if you talk to any parent who had their kids home, I'm sorry, he's so excited about life. But if you talk to parents who had their kids home from March through now, they've spent a lot more money on food. Who knew that that would be such a barrier for student success, or even for family success? So it's things like that we want to help support by offering meals 2 or sometimes even 3 times a day, depending on the side of town. We're trying to make sure that students have access to laptops, but still remembering that if kids have only ever worked with a QWERTY keyboard, they don't know Mavis Beacon. They don't know how to type the way we do. They sometimes struggle to even Google things. So I just want to make sure that you all know that we are certainly considering all of that, which is why we sent out a parent and staff survey to really understand, well, what is it that parents want? We could guess all day. We could put in our own individual perspectives, but it's great to hear from the community directly. And that's influencing us as well. But we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that there is a citywide and a statewide component to our decision. Back in, what was it, late April, early May, Governor Lee decided that we would go ahead and shut down schools, which many of us thought was a great thing because the virus had spread so rapidly. So that may very well be a case. It could be the case that based on city numbers that Mayor Cooper decides that, hey, we just don't need to open these buildings and have 97,000 people flooding into schools, 97,000 being 86,000 kids and 11,000 staff. So like Frida said, or like Mrs. Peter said, there are a lot of moving parts. We have to be mindful of all of them, but we also know that we have to allow time for prep. We have to announce a decision so that preparation can be made. And then we have to be ready to, I hate this word, but we've got to be ready to pivot quickly if things change.
Great. So Christian, you bring up a really great point, which is that there are multiple levels of leadership that are all honing in on this one decision. So for our audience, what decisions or responsibilities belong to the state versus the school board? And then also, what role do individual principals have in making decisions about what the school year will look like?
Great question, and I'll try to make it succinct, but I think it's fairly easy for us to understand that there are, different levels of protocol or supersession, right? So whatever the school board decides can be overturned by the city. The mayor can step in and say, hey, that's not quite that's not quite the vision we have based on health data. Whatever the city decides could very easily be either overturned or supported by the state, and the governor could come in and say, I really don't think this is a great idea. This is what I would prefer you all do. So with that in mind, it's hard to pin down the exact, details of what we have control over. But based on our charter, it's pretty much we have the ability to make suggestions. We have the ability to move forward until we're stopped. I think that's the easiest way for me to describe it. But you asked a great question about principals and principal autonomy for all of our schools, charter, traditional, magnet. We want to offer our schools autonomy, but we also have to have some consistency. Not only are these unprecedented times regarding health, but these are unprecedented times financially and economically. So there are families who are already transient and moving from one house to another, sleeping on people's couches. So we've got to be sure that whatever is happening in one corner of the city, that is replicated and sustainable, and actually mirrors it in another part of the city in case families have to move based on whatever the virus does. So because of that, we cannot allow complete autonomy as we would like to. So it's going to be a district decision whether to open schools, whether to move virtually or not. Just to give you a heads up, we are considering the idea of at least allowing teachers to come into their classrooms, no matter, whether we're virtual or in person, because if you're anything like me, sometimes you need to be in your office. There are materials that you have or research that you've gathered, or even books that you forgot about back in May that you didn't gather. So I'll stop there and see if you want to add anything in, Frida.
I think the best way to put it, principals have the ability in the way they implement certain parts of it, particularly like teachers who teach certain classes, from the implementation part, from the finer details, but the school district sets the overall standard. And just like Ms. Bugg said, the state can say whether we can open and close, the mayor can say whether we can open and close, and then we're responsible for the implementation of that and make sure that implementation is equitable and fair and consistent across. And then the principals can come in and say, this teacher can teach this subject, that subject, this teacher can do virtual, this teacher will do in person. And that's where the principal's autonomy comes in when it comes to the actual implementation on the school level side.
I added one more thing. I'm sorry, Arsha. But the state has already told us, hey, you are responsible for a 180-day school year. We need you all to be responsible for 6.5 days of learning every day of those 180 days. So that's one mandate that we're keeping in mind, that no matter whether it's virtual or in person, we have to be sure that we are offering learning. Now, I saw a question in the chat, and I'm not going to move forward too quickly, Arsha, I promise. But students with any kind of exceptional need, whether they be on one side of the spectrum as gifted or they fall anywhere else along the spectrum, we have to make sure that we're doing right by those students as well. So sometimes students who require occupational therapy, speech pathologists, physical therapy, we're still kind of thinking through what those supports look like, because again, we have to be mindful of the child safety, the staff safety, and the parent safety. So if any of those members are members of a vulnerable population, we have to be ready to make accommodations in a different way. So we're still thinking through those things, trying to resource them, looking at CARES Act dollars from both the city and the state level on how we can make those happen. But we've got to have 180 days no matter what.
Great. So let's actually talk about CARES Act dollars. We had a few questions from the audience about that. How can we use those CARES Act dollars, and what is MNPS planning on using them for?
I mean, basically it's any, COVID-related expenses. And so MNPS and Mayor Cooper decided to use a lot of the dollars, the majority of dollars, to go to purchasing technology, laptops and hotspots for children and families to be able to do virtual learning, whether they choose to do that or to supplement the in-person learning. And so that's the primary goal. I mean, that's the one thing we realized. We all knew there was an equity going on with regards to resources, but the COVID really heightened and really became, it really also brought to awareness to more county-wide the inequities that goes on through the county, which if you're a leader, if you're a parent, you already knew about, but then there's some parts of the populations who really didn't understand the depth of those inequities and things like that. So I know I got a call for a couple of people like, why isn't Metro Steel Schools doing the virtual transition as quickly as some of the private schools, as some of the charter schools? And it goes back to that system of 85,000 kids and 11,000 employees. You can't change a system overnight. If you're a charter school, if you're a private school, you're only dealing mostly at best less than 1,000 students. And then you only have, scores of staff and faculty. So it's easier to flip over when you're doing a whole system and you have to worry about logistics, operations, and academic learning. And so our key thing is, how do we make sure that kids have the resources, particularly that families that have 2 or more children, that they have enough resources within that one household? Because realistically, if you have 2 siblings, they can't share one computer over a 6-hour day. And so we wanted to make sure, A, that we can get the technology, we can resource that technology, be able to access and distribute that, and make sure we have what we need to start. So that was the commitment from the mayor, and he fulfilled it. That was commitment from Dr. Battle, that they fulfilled that. Also the poverty level and the economic level, that Even though they may have a computer, they might have access to a hotspot, because usually maybe the parent's smartphone is the only access to internet that they have, or the hotspot they have for the family. And so for that to use, and then you have the parent still has to work, and the two children have to work, have to do schooling, that's a lot of strain on data, and that's a lot of expense. And given where the parent may have been furloughed or pay had been cut, that's also an expense. So we had to make sure there was hotspots, or some who just simply couldn't afford an extra bill. Internet's not cheap. And so make sure we have those resources, and that, so we have to get those out and distribute it. So that was the main thing, is getting technology, and technology costs. Even if you buy a cheap computer, you're still looking at $350, $400, and that's not including a hotspot, which may cost anywhere from $60 to $70, and that's not including the service to go with the hotspot. So to understand that, and where we are with the budget, the constraints that we had, that's where we used the dollars to be able to beef up our technological resources and to be able to distribute. So that's where the majority of it, and that was $26 million. That's basically almost all that, the money that we went directly into technology. And particularly also too, we understand that in this day and age, we live in a very capitalistic society. So we would have to, we're competing with the other, hundreds of school districts across the country that are also trying to do that. And I also talk about the higher ed institutions. So trying to resource that it's a good financial buy for us, the best possible given this environment, but then also to resources and to acquire them.
Thank you. So we know that our most vulnerable students get so much more than just an education from school. So everything from safety to meals, the ability for adults to provide them counseling, and then also report when something is wrong with that child at home or in the community. So what are we doing as a school district to ensure that our most vulnerable students are getting all of the other services that schools provide?
I can jump in here. This is where the hardest shift happens, because I've had parents say, well, what's going to be the plan for a priority school? Well, it's hard to say what one plan is, because every school is going to be different. So I'll go down a brief rabbit hole to kind of provide some context. When I worked at Neely's Bend, we were on the priority list, but we were a level 5 school. So we were the school you wanted your child at because they were growing, but we were getting students who were not proficient. So what our priority status looked like might have been different from what, say, Jerry Baxter back in the day, what its priority status looked like, or what even Brick Church, what their priority status looked like. So there is not going to be a one size fits all, because there are some schools that have to have, or better yet, there are some instances where a child needs a one-to-one paraprofessional, meaning they have some sort of maybe physical disability that they need assistance with, or maybe they have a cognitive delay of some sort and they need a one-on-one. Or maybe it's just that they have a deficit that we're looking to try to supplement. Maybe they didn't learn something and they need more foundational skills. Those 3 different types of student learners are going to be resourced differently. So that's where Mrs. Player Peters is saying that we want to work with principals more closely. Unfortunately, because of our budget woes, we had to yet again cut from central office. And I know central office tends to be kind of a negative phrase. People look at them like it's a bunch of people there making a bunch of money. I say all the time, my dad works in central office and he makes about $30,000 a year. They act as fidelity measures. They are there to support across our 163 schools, to make sure that not only they have all the resources that they need, but that whatever questions, suggestions, or concerns they have are being elevated quickly. So if we don't find out about a student's need or need for an accommodation until late July, we still need to be able to very quickly find a parapro that matches that need, or that can provide that accommodation, or whatever other external support. So working with Cornerstone, working with speech pathologists, or any of those things, right? So it's going to be very different, but it's something that is at the top of the list. I'm sorry I can't give more of a definitive answer, but it's because it's going to be so different for every child. Frida, what would you add?
I think we're very mindful of this. Like, this is one of the things of we know when students come back, even if you are what deems to be a healthy child, kids have still suffered trauma because we're going back and forth between the phases. You're hearing about wearing masks, what this virus is doing and acting changes literally from day to day, week to week. And so we're being very intentional when we open schools that kids are going to be a little nervous because they feel us as adults being nervous. They, you know, kids are sponges. Like, they're watching TV too. They're hearing things, you know, via social media. And so we want to be very cognizant of how do we create that safe environment for them, and how do we provide a space for them to express their feelings, to express their fears, but then also learn in that environment, because this is a new environment, especially, particularly, you know, Christian can speak more to it than I can, but, you know, when you have, you know, children, particularly in kindergarten, first, second grade, you know, and they haven't seen their friends in literally 6 months, they want to go and hug and touch and, you know, do what kids do, you know, and understand the concept of, you know, you got to stay back and you can't always touch, and, you know, keep your mask on, fiddling, things like that. Be able to also coach them through that and coach that them emotionally, you know, potty training and stuff enough. I hear from my friends who have children, you know, just the efforts of potty training, and that's just something in a right of ritual path.
Let me tell you about this potty training, okay? I appreciate the lockdown because it gave me dedicated time to sit his butt on the potty. Again, just in transparency for any parents, feel free to send me some notes in the chat, but we're doing the no pants potty training where he just runs around just bare butt, you know, so he can sit on the potty. But it's been great for those kind of things for me. But again, I know that I'm privileged in that way. I can be away from my computer or away, you know, I can work with him. But I'm sorry to take you away, Frida, but you just triggered me with that potty training because, child, it has been a struggle. But I do want to make sure that I let the community know that there are about 3 things that are at the top of our list: health and safety, food, just literally being able to feed our kids, and then social emotional learning. I mean, if you are one of those adults that's had a hard time sitting down or that's had a hard time wearing a mask, imagine what, not just a 4-year-old, but a 14-year-old, imagine what that looks like for them. Imagine the anxiety that they feel, the uncertainty and the fear, but then also think about what it will mean for them to see other adults outside of their family finally. They are going to run into each other's arms, sneeze, and keep moving. You know, I mean, I hate to be so I don't know. I don't even know the word for it, but it's so crude, but it's honest.
It's very real. I mean, that's one of the things too, like, and this is I'm going to my political soapbox real quick. Like, this is the first time in history we've had an all women board. And so we are very cognizant of natural caretakers, of not saying men aren't, and not saying past men on the board who were great fathers don't understand this, but we're also very in tune of what our children do. You know, I don't have kids, but I have plenty of friends have kids, you know, auntie to many. And so it's one of those things that we're very cognizant of. What does that look like? What does that look like for a teacher, for a parent? And those realistic things that go day to day, we see it from a very particular lens, and that we want to be very cognizant of. I mean, that's one of the beauties of having, you know, director of schools who have young children. She's living it every day. So she's very cognizant of what does that look like for a teacher. Besides her background as a teacher and a principal, she's still a mother first. And so she understands what that looks like, and making sure that we are being cognizant of, and that we're not having unrealistic expectation when it comes to kids being kids, and let kids being kids, and then being through this unique time, that we'll be able to help kids transition from being at home and being in a very relaxed environment into being a more structured environment in the classroom.
So we know that eventually we will go back to school. And so when that happens, what can students, parents, and teachers expect when it comes to health and safety protocols in classrooms and also in shared spaces like the school bus?
I mean, we've ordered masks, we've ordered hand sanitizer, we've ordered other sanitizing supplies, so we're catching up on that. And that's one thing we're also cognizant of. I mean, from a systems perspective, and I think also I want people to always understand that we as a board, we have to manage a system. We have to manage a system of almost 100,000 people, of almost $1 billion in funds. And so we have to manage the consistency. And even from that, from a logistics standpoint, we also are competing with hospitals and first responders and other school districts. So one thing we started doing very early on when we realized prepping for this is that we're making sure that we have PPE available, because, you know, if kids can't afford to eat, they can't afford masks. They can't afford hand sanitizer. You know, that was one of the big things even before COVID happened, when you had the teacher's donation list, hand sanitizers on it, but now it's even more prevalent. So that's one thing we're making sure. We're also trying to figure out what protocols can we put in place at each individual school level of what does it look like coming in? Do we have enough thermometers? Do we have to record? And going through a lot of those logistical issues And so that's one thing we can look for. And that's why it's very important that we provide the option of doing the virtual. So you can still have that virtual option. You can come home and even if we can get to a, I'll say, lack of a better phrase, a dormant part of the COVID until we get a vaccine, that you can come back to school during a certain period of time. And you can't go willy-nilly, like 1 week I'm going virtual, next week I'm going in person. But there has to be a certain threshold so we can do a smooth transition from each. But then also for parents who have to, because they're essential workers or do feel comfortable sending their child to school, that they can also have that option also.
So Christian, you touched on the fact that we have to have 180 days of school and 6.5 hours of learning per day. Several of the participants in the chat are wondering, how can that be divided up? Is there a plan C if in person, plan A, and all virtual plan B could potentially be altered? And what could that look like?
So at one point, I think we were floating between about 7 different plans. Please know that MNPS didn't stop moving on, what was it, March 10th, when the NBA season got canceled. Tom Hanks had it, and we decided to send our students home, not to return, right? We didn't just stop moving, we kept working. But again, there's so many moving parts, which is why it was hard for me to answer this last question. And I'm sorry, Frida, I just let you have it all because I couldn't do it, because things are changing so quickly and so often. There's so many moving parts. You know, it could be that if we have to just live with COVID-20 and then a version of COVID-21, you know, it could be that we have to be separated in some ways. You know, our students won't be able to, you know, think pair share, that it will be more individualized, or it may even be that we have to do some sort of hybrid for a while around virtual learning, but it's just so hard because we don't know. So I was going somewhere with it, and I'm sorry I lost my train of thought. Frida, over to you, sis.
I mean, I think we're always considering, but also to understand, we have to remember what's equitable. I mean, we have to be very careful when, I mean, I've seen things on social media about different creative plans, but also one thing we have to consider, that we can't do something for one side of the district and not have it available to the other side, or something comparable with that. So that's one thing we have to be very mindful, and that's hard to do with 85,000 students. So I will also want to put that in mind. So I mean, I'm pretty sure we're considering plan C's, and we're trying to work that out, but we also have to work out the logistics and operations. But also too, we have to also realize there's liability issues. And that one thing, I mean, we live in a litigious society, and if you've one of our board meetings over the past year or two, you'll see how litigious we are naturally. And some of it's right, and some of it, you know, we will thank God for attorneys. But we also have to figure out what's the liability of having plan C, and can we as a district do that fiduciary responsibility, and that's what's fair. So even though there's a lot of creative ideas out there, it's one thing to put it on paper, it's another thing to implement it system-wide. And you know, and a lot of people see things through their individual school, and zone school, or their magnet school, or school of choice, which is great. But also, it's our fiduciary responsibility as a board to do it from a systems level and make sure that we do it. Because the worst thing we want to do is put something out there, and then we get sued, and then we have to have $1 million financial outlay that's not going back into the classroom because we did something because we weren't thoughtful and we didn't do our fiduciary responsibility of implementing the equity and the fairness of it. Christian?
I have 2 things that you just made me think of, Frida. So one is that, you know, think about what it's like on snow days when, you know, it might snow in Jolton, or it might, you know, be really heavy in South Nashville, but your area of town isn't hit. It's hard to say. I've heard so many families say, well, why don't you just shut down those schools that are hit? Because it doesn't quite work like that anymore. We are not as communal as we once were. So it's not that families who live in their neighborhood work in their neighborhood also. It would be one thing if that were the case. But we have staff that are driving literally from Antioch to work in Bellevue, or are driving from East Nashville to work in North Nashville. We have students who live in Antioch and go to school in East Nashville, or vice versa. I mean, we are very transient in that way, just daily, our daily movement. So the same happens with with COVID, with this virus that we still don't know much about, that we have to be mindful of the staff members who are vulnerable. We have to be mindful of students who are vulnerable. And then we also have to be mindful of their actual location in the city and how different it will look based on the resources of the school or the community engagement around the school or just the population of the school.
So it sounds like from both of you that parents will have a bit of discretion whether they decide to send their child in person or virtual. Is that also true for MNPS employees?
Yes. Oh, go ahead, Frida.
I mean, yes, to a certain extent. I mean, they're still employees; they still have to work. We want to be very mindful, and putting on my union hat, make sure it's very, a very safe environment. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure they're working out some of what teachers can do virtual, particularly those who may have pre-existing conditions or are in a very vulnerable situation, and then those who do in-person classes. But we'll make sure that our employees are safe. That's something that's very important to me. That because the teacher is a very critical part. I mean, that's one of the questions I've always asked is if a teacher happens to contract COVID, what's the kind of the contingency plan with that? And so, but we also have to manage 2,000 people. I mean, we're still hiring people, we're still putting vacancies. And when you put shift in one, it's a moving constant shift board. So, so we want to be very mindful that their health is a priority and that we're very mindful of those needs and not be sensitive to that. So that's one of the things we're trying to look through of, what teachers can do, what are health issues without, violating any privacy issues, and be very, very, very mindful of that process.
Again, it comes down to, individual schools and individual people, as people. And we've had a lot of the same question around, why is it that it's a semester decision that once I decide that I will either keep my my student at home or send them to school, that is for an entire semester. And unfortunately, it's just because of the thought that has to go behind and the preparation that has to go into moving, if we made accommodations or we've made allotments of funding for a certain number of teachers to either be in person or to manage virtual learning, it's hard to make that shift quickly and equitably and consistently. So we're still looking at ways that we can better support that. But our first step was to make sure that it wasn't a full year decision. It wasn't a year-long decision, that you wouldn't be locked in for the entire 2021 school year. But now our next move is trying to think through, well, if we don't have enough enough staff who feel comfortable being in person, but we have a lot of families who want in-person learning, how do we supplement that? How do we accommodate for that? But then also, how do we make sure that we're not too overbearing on teachers or parents? And that virtual learning is very, very family driven. That is just a reality that parents have got to be engaged in a lot of different ways, and some just either don't have the capacity or don't feel as comfortable, and that's just a reality that we understand and are working to support. But for now, we're going with the semester long plan because it just takes so much to make sure that we have the right ratios of students and that we have the appropriate supports. And I just thought about something else, if you don't mind. I remember someone asked about breaking up the 180 days. So yes, there are some I don't know, we have some allowances, but for the most part, they ask us to stick to their very strict calendar that has a certain number of in-service days, a certain number of holidays, a certain number of half days, and a certain number of days that have to be dedicated towards professional development. So we are, still kind of at the behest of the state, but we're working to make sure that it's as equitable as possible.
And two things real quick. First, with also switching, we're gonna be very cognizant of the curriculum calendar. And that when you switch from the virtual to online learning, the virtual to in-person to virtual, that we're on a consistent calendar, so that when you switch over, you're actually on the same lesson plan for, with the verse, so you can make that transition smoothly. So that's one thing we have to be very cognizant of, that we're still staying on a consistent schedule, kind of like what you do for IB or Cambridge, that no matter you're on the world, you're on the same curriculum syllabus level. And then also with the consistency of the 180 days and 65, also remember, we get a large part of our funding through the BEP. And part of the BEP is how many days you're in school. That affects the amount that we get from the state. So also we have to be very mindful of, we get about 47% of our funding from the state. So we have to also make sure that we have a consistent calendar schedule to make sure we get we draw down on state funds, because even though we get, was it 922 million? I think we're at like 914 this past budget. That's the local portion. We're not even including the state portion of that funds also.
So it looks like in our audience, we have an 8-year-old, and she is wondering what the school day will look like once we're back in person. And so I know a lot of parents and families are thinking about this too. How do we expect lunch, recess, sports, and all of the other fun extra parts of the school day to be impacted?
They will be heavily impacted. That is the best response I can offer you. That if you're asking us today, considering that just a few days ago we had 600 new cases and then 400 new cases and then 350 new cases, I think we shouldn't plan to, because I want you to understand that I'm compassionate and I understand it's been hard for me not to see my friends. So I cannot imagine how kids who didn't get to say goodbye to their friends and their favorite teachers or even their favorite bus driver or lunch lady, how they've been impacted. But the reality is, because of the health disparities and just the consequences of our health choices, that we likely just need to plan that our students won't be able to see each other for a minute, or if they can see each other, they won't be allowed to be in close proximity in large groups. So that definitely will impact sports in different ways. That definitely impacts the lunch schedule. I've heard some principals talking to me about that it's easy in elementary school to have kids eat in their classroom because they're kind of accustomed to that and they can still see each other even though they wouldn't be touching. But middle and high school students are used to being able to share snacks and congregate in the the lunchroom or even out in the hallways during lunch. That's kind of a free period for them, and I don't know that will be the case unless things change drastically. Now, again, when things change, we know that it's inevitable that we will go back to in-person learning, but we again don't know what the state of the world will look like then. Will it be that we are always aware of COVID and we're a much more hand-washing society, or is it that we have to consistently be aware not to linger and not to touch you off? And it's just, unfortunately, a lot of that is just still up in the air.
Yeah, I think realistically, and I totally understand, because I was that athlete person who played a bunch of sports, and I was that extracurricular person, and so I totally understand where you're coming from, and thank you for being on the call and listening to us, especially as an 8-year-old. So we're glad you're here, you're learning. So realistically, you're probably gonna have lunch inside your classroom. We don't know what classroom that would be because that's all individual. You're probably gonna come in and have your temperature checked every day. And we're probably going to ask you to use sanitizers and wash your hands a lot to practice good health skills. And then, we'll probably won't be able to do a lot of high contact sports. If you play something like basketball, that's probably going to be put on hold, or, maybe if you do something like cross country, well, you're 8-year-old, I think you do cross country I started cross country in middle school. And so things like that, those solo sports, it'd probably be more realistic, but in team sports, unfortunately, which I absolutely love and adore, you probably won't be able to do to the same aspect that you want to. So that's one thing I would expect. So hopefully we'll try to do our best to keep those bubbles within your classrooms, and you'll spend a lot of time with your classmates and get to know them very well, and not be able to interchange like you usually do through that. But I think that's one thing you can expect.
This is another one that's just so hard. I'm sorry, Arsha. I'll make it quick though, but this is where it gets so hard because, like you said, we've been athletes, and if you remember March, that next week, our students, our basketball boys and girls, our basketball teams, both male and female, were heading to the state tournament. They didn't get to finish out that season, and I've already had football players reach out and say, this was going to be my shining year. This is my senior year. This is my time to be seen by TSSAA. But in the back of my head, I'm also thinking about, I ran track. That was how I got to college. I had a track scholarship initially, and just thinking about passing the baton. I play basketball. I can't tell you how many times I nastily sneezed, and then I see Grace Strange on here. I mean, all of our germs were always intermingled on that basketball. So, you didn't think about it, but it's those kind of things that, we have to be aware of, and we have to be mindful that they are young people who are not as enthralled in this as maybe we are as adults, but who still need to be coached through. We still have to be mindful of them. So many moving parts, and it's so hard because we have to think about all the students and all the families and their different desires.
So for families and students who are typically receiving services or potentially have an IP and receive services through that, should they expect to be able to receive those virtually as well?
I think we're really trying our best to do that. The question is, what does that look like? I think that's one of the things we're very cognizant to make sure the support staff is there to a specialized ratio, particularly those of IEPs, to do the support within the virtual, especially in the virtual environment. So that's something that we're looking at and examining, and that we're very cognizant of if you have an IEP, what does that look like? And particularly having the support staff along with the teacher be able to work side by side, like Christian said earlier, that having that support, that one-on-one, make sure the support staff is there within the virtual classroom with children with IEPs to make sure they get the same level of service. So we're going to try it's very important to us to try to get close to that as possible. Of course, it won't be the same because you're in a virtual environment, but we're going to try to see what we can do to get close to that and make sure we have the staff to supplement those with IEPs.
So the only thing that I would add is that it's very true, and I can tell you from firsthand experience. I told you that my parents divorced when I was young, so I have two sets of parents, right? Well, one of my dads works in central office, another is a parapro at Jerry Baxter. Another, my stepmom is a one-to-one parapro at Hattie Cotton, right? I asked her about her experience, and she said, I tried to get on the computer when I could, but because of my child's special need, or the extent of his special need, we couldn't do a whole lot of work together. So we definitely elevated those kind of conversations, particularly around parapros that are one-to-one. And I'm sorry to use that kind of lingo, but what one-to-one means is there may be a child that has some kind of exceptional need that requires specific accommodations consistently throughout the day. So they have one teacher's aide or one paraprofessional that works with them. So imagine if a parapro doesn't have a computer at home. How are they engaging with their child? Imagine if they needed to be able to perform occupational therapy supports, but they don't have their swing or the slide or different, just different resources that belong in the classroom. So we are, again, talking through those and trying to make individual determinations. But I would say if you are a parent or know a parent who has a child that has an IEP, an individualized education plan, please reach out to principals and teachers right now. Go ahead and start developing out and talking through what your accommodation requests are, what your needs are, and be ready with any kind of data you have over this 6-month period about it, either their regression or new milestones that they've hit. Because I've heard stories of students who, like my mom was telling me about a parent she knew whose child had some kind of exceptional needs, but they had learned 5 words. Well, just over the course of 3 months, they lost all 5 words. They could no longer say those. So, keeping that kind of data in mind and being able to present it to your teaching staff now will help students and help us in the long run. So please urge a parent of a child with any kind of exceptional needs to reach out to the principal and or the teacher today.
Something that we know impacts all students in a really beneficial way are specific curriculums that potentially are trauma-informed, teach social emotional learning, or have a focus on anti-racism. And so as something that we know is even more talked about and important today, is MNPS considering adding things like that and making them system-wide?
Yes. Short answer, yes, and yes. So, this has been a time of not just a viral pandemic, but finally the world is realizing that, our race relations are not quite what they should be. I don't consider myself a racist, but maybe I've said or done some things that have impacted other ethnic groups. And I appreciate that, but we need to drill down that and do a deeper dive. So when we look at social emotional learning supports, when we look at the disparity based on the disparity of consequence doling out based on race, we see that we have not done the better job we were hoping to do. So social emotional learning supports have to include some kind of bias training. So when I thought about, not continuing to just attack the symptom of bias is disparity, but the root of bias is not having realized it yourself. So I say this all the time, kind of ashamedly, but just to share with community members that they may want to do a deeper dive, within themselves, that here I was, an African-American female NASA scientist, physicist at that, actually astrophysicist, because my minor was in astronomy, right? I came back to Nashville to teach, and here I saw myself being biased towards my female and African-American students. I saw myself pairing up my Black girls with white male colleagues because, what if she just doesn't get it? when I had that realization, I was heartbroken, about my own bias. Like, how dare I be that person? And I don't think many of our staff understand where their bias lie or how it impacts our students, whether it's lowering expectations, not providing them the same grace. I mean, anything. So in collaboration with a few community members, I'm developing an anti-racism policy that kind of mimics or mirrors what's happening in Hamilton County. They're doing something like that also, but they're starting with their council members and their school board. And I thought that was phenomenal. They're making sure that leaders around the city have this anti-racism or bias training, not to make anyone feel like they're the bad guy, but to make sure that we are doing internal reflections about how our votes, our choices, our day-to-day interactions, how that impacts certain ethnic groups. And I think that we'll begin to see a shift, but it will be incremental. I do need to spend this time and say, if there's a policy or there's language that might be helpful towards MNPS or really towards any government agency, please feel free to help us develop policies. We are policy passers, but anyone can be a policy maker. Anyone can. I've had NOAA, Passage, the Public Defender's Office, Juvenile Court Clerk. They've all come together before to help develop a policy, and then I help to pass it. So we are looking at those things, but we need help from the community also.
And I want to kind of piggyback on that and kind of maybe answer some of the questions that were in the chat room. And also the systemic part of it when it comes to resources. I think that's one of the things that was highlighted, particularly during the first part of COVID at the end of last year, and that we really relied on our community partners. I know Amazon and Dell, and forgive me for the other community partners that we're not doing, but using our community schools to help work us through this COVID situation and this COVID circumstances and environment to help really fulfill some of those inequity needs of resources, particularly we're doing with children, what they have access to regards of healthcare, clothing, other wraparound services, that we're also relying to our community partners and leveraging that we're using them to help address some of those needs. Not only the individual part, which Ms. Buggs, perfectly articulated, but then also we have the systematic part of it. And I mean, to be very cognizant of how do we bring some of those resources to that and those wraparound services when it talks about systemic racism, because not only systemic racism is have the bias part, which is, the micro part, and you have the macro part of what resources are around those schools to make sure that happen. Particularly, someone asked about buses and what the bus routes look like. More likely, we'll probably have several bus routes doing something, a bus going at least 2 or 3 times going towards school. So we probably have to change what time a bus pickup happens to a certain time to make sure we have that social distancing on the bus. Because there's some areas of town where their parents can afford to drop them off before work and they have that flexibility to do it, or if their parents are working from home, they can drop them off in the other parts of town when you ever have to work a hard first shift or a second shift, you're not going to be able to have that flexibility. And so we have to work around those things and making sure we provide transportation, work with those students who take MTA, those who don't, those who ride the school bus, make sure that we have those consistencies and those wraparound services, because that's part of the inequity. I mean, we didn't provide a transportation, we didn't vote for a transportation plan a while back. So we have to kind of supplement, that in a way that we can. And using part of the CARES Fund Act and working with Metro General Government to really do that. So I think that's one of the things of how do we use our community partners to fill in those wraparound services, because the lack of resources due to systemic racism, particularly with certain parts of town, that we have to address that through financial means and then through just services.
So we are almost out of time, but our audience has great questions and feedback that they would want to share with the school board. Can you both tell us the best ways that they should be able to contact or share their feedback?
Sorry about that. I keep being that guy, but sorry, I jumped the gun. I added my email address and phone number. Please feel free to call, text, email me. Now, also be advised, please call, text, or email. If I do not respond immediately, please feel free to follow back up. My son is in the screen phase, so he's been snatching my phone to play game. I'm gonna play game. Mommy, can I play game? So just be mindful. Please feel free to follow up with me and I will reach back out with a response.
And then I'm typing mine in as we speak. So frida.player@mnps.org, frida@schools on Facebook. And then also put my phone number in there also, so you can reach out to us. And one question was also in there real quick, like, will we start, it's possible speaking out will we start after Labor Day? And that could be a very possibility. If we're still in phase 2, if you look at the phase, we probably would not be opening. So it all depends what the public does. And I'm gonna make my PSA of wearing a mask because I know people are talking about their civil liberties, but liberties have cost and they have consequences. And part of that consequence is we as a community do not stop the spread. It affects our children. Whether our children go back to school is gonna depend on what we do as a community as a whole. And we must own that as a community, that we must make sure that we are doing our part, because what the community does as a whole affects our children and what we can do and we can operate. So depending where we are, there might be a true realistic aspect that we might not start until after Labor Day, just giving what the mayor and the governor does and what happens with the spike and how we continue to grow over the next 2 weeks. If we don't bring that spread down to less than a 1-to-1 person, that's a very realistic part that we might start for Labor Day. So it's one of those things I wish, I'm a planner. I'm a daughter of a logistics in the Department of Army. So I understand plan. My father's like, I have plan A, B, C, D, and E. And we cannot provide that because we don't know what the community is going to do. And what the community does affects what we do as a school system. So so that's where we are. So we'll keep our fingers crossed, but we will be in constant communications through the press to let you know what's going on.
Frida, Christian, thank you so much for your leadership and for your time today. Audience, thank you for submitting some really great questions and for joining. If you are interested in learning more about the Women's Political Collaborative, there is a link in the chat for you to join the organization and learn more about our cause. Additionally, next week on July 17th, there is an additional Lunch and Learn, and this one includes Congressman Cooper, State Representative Bob Freeman, and Metro Council member Sandra Sepulveda. We encourage all of you to check out the chat and add yourself to that Lunch and Learn and join our group. Frida, Christian, thank you again, and everyone have a really great day. Thanks.